thing that the Russians are very good at is electronic warfare. A lot of American stuff, Javelin missile, HIMARS, Copperhead missiles, which is a guided artillery shell, it works for a week or two, and the Russians figure out how to jam the navigation or the command link, and the stuff goes blind. As you look at even what's happening in Ukraine, first of all, don't listen to the idiot politicians that say, yeah, we've degraded the Russian army. No, we have chewed up a lot of material. The Russian army has gotten infinitely smarter.
We shouldn't have started this operation at all, infantryman Alexei Deshevy told the publication. I'm just not sure it was worth it, said Maria Pankova, who mourned a friend who fought for the Ukrainian armed forces and went missing in the Kursk region. The defeat of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kursk region has forced many Ukrainians to demand explanations from the authorities about the logic of this failed operation, writes Reuters, a British publication. As noted in the article, the retreat of the Ukrainian armed forces from Sudzha raised questions and deepened the public rift in Ukraine over the benefits of the invasion. The liberation of the territories occupied by the Ukrainian armed forces allowed Russia to eliminate a potential trump card that Kiev would have tried to use in negotiations. And my friends, it's not just the Ukrainian soldiers who are becoming more and more disillusioned about their leaders' decisions with respect to this Ukraine war.
I think it's a friendly fire.
Friendly fire? Oh, I don't hope. No.
But very, very closely.
American mercenaries participating in the fighting in Ukraine on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces are calling for a ceasefire, and Donald Trump's rise to power in the United States has been a blow to them, writes the British publication, The Times. In quotations, all Americans were seeking a ceasefire to stop the fighting, the article says. The mercenaries, according to the newspaper, complained of huge losses. One of them, a medic from the Delta team, told of a mission that resulted in 90% casualties for his company.
I'm going to walk around like this. Hey guys, it's me, Imran.
But there is perhaps no bigger sign that this war has gone terribly wrong for Ukraine and the West than the opening quote from this bombshell article in The Hill, a prominent media outlet in America. I rarely agree with President Trump, it begins, but his latest controversial statements about Ukraine are mostly true. They seem preposterous only because Western audiences have been fed a steady diet of disinformation about Ukraine for more than a decade.
It's pretty fucked up. Oh shit. Did you hear all the crap?
So my friends, as you can see, we have some very interesting reports for today. First, we will look briefly at the important points from the British Times article on foreign mercenaries begging for a ceasefire. Then we will look deeply at a recent assessment from Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov about various sectors of the front. In particular, he has some unique insights not only on the Kursk front, but also on the Chasiv, Toretsk, and Siversk sectors. Lastly, we will delve deeply into this bombshell article from The Hill entitled, Sadly, Trump is Right About Ukraine. But before we do, help keep this alternative media program running with super thanks donations, and most of all, consider joining the channel membership. This is where I have exclusive long-form analysis, breaking news not reported in the mainstream media, and lastly, raw combat footage that isn't suitable for YouTube. Stick around to the end for bonus footage and a membership trailer video in the end screen. And with that, let's get into it.
It's no good.
I remember looking at one sunflower that was taller than the weeds, thinking that we were all going to bleed out and die here, he said. As noted in the article, the change in the US position on the Ukrainian issue after Donald Trump came to power was a blow to American mercenaries. In quotations, there was a moment where I thought we were actually going to go to war with America. It was like Order 66 from Star Wars, where the Jedi are declared traitors to the Empire and ordered to be killed. It was like, oh crap, all my friends are going to try to kill me, complained Dutch, a 25-year-old mercenary. The Russian Ministry of Defense was repeatedly stated that the Kiev regime uses foreign mercenaries as cannon fodder, and that Russian troops will continue to destroy them throughout Ukraine. Those who came to fight for money admitted in many interviews that the Ukrainian military poorly coordinates their actions, and the chances of surviving the battles are small, since the intensity of the conflict is incomparable with their usual Afghanistan and the Middle East. Now let's take a look at what's happening on the front, according to a Ukrainian journalist, Yuri Butusov. So we see a certain situation that our troops have withdrawn from the city of Suja and are actually holding two separate bridgeheads on the territory of the Russian Federation, he begins his report. These bridgeheads are advantageous heights and forest areas. These bridgeheads allow us to control the border strip. These heights are on the territory of the Russian Federation. Whoever controls them controls the border strip. Moreover, with the development of drone technology, it is obvious that this is control of kilometers for 15, which is in one direction and which is in the other. Therefore, it is obvious that these bridgeheads, these heights, which are now defended by Ukrainian soldiers, the Kursk group of troops, are of very important importance. The Russian enemy, he said, tried to attack and continues to attack now, but the intensity of these attacks after our troops have already regrouped on these lines has significantly decreased. The Russians in this direction still have a significant advantage in drones, a significant advantage in infantry and combat equipment. Nevertheless, the front line has now been significantly shortened. The rear of the Ukrainian troops is not so vulnerable now. The enemy no longer shoots our logistic routes and the flanks with all types of weapons. Therefore, our defense line has become denser, and here our defense is effective, he claims. Our troops are receiving effective fire support. The use of unmanned aerial vehicles is improving, because finally competent people are appointed to lead these drone operations. That is, in general, the situation looks stabilized, he claims. This, however, he assures, does not mean that this front will not move. The Russians continue to attack. The task of the Russian command is to knock the Ukrainian troops out of Kursk from Russian territory completely by the end of March, he says. And no one is cancelling these plans. The Russians continue to attack. Nevertheless, now, if just 2 weeks ago the situation in Kursk was simply catastrophic because the Russians completely controlled our logistics, all our communications, now there is no such factor. The front has narrowed and our troops are fighting quite well here now and inflicting losses on the Russians, which at this stage significantly outweigh the Ukrainian losses. Meanwhile, further south, on the Chasiv and Toretsk front, Mr. Butusov says the Russians continue active offensive operations in this direction. The Russian command is currently carrying out numerous attacks on the soldiers of the 28th Mechanized Brigade, and it is trying to capture Chasiv, carrying out attacks on the soldiers of the 24th Mechanized Brigade, the 5th Assault Brigade, and the 18th National Guard Brigade. The fighting is very heavy. The Russians have seized the tactical initiative in these areas. Our soldiers are inflicting losses on the Russians, but this area is now under attack, and of course, our soldiers there need reinforcement. Reinforcement, he says, with all types of necessary forces and means in order to attempt to defeat the Russian offensive. In the Toretsk area, it is important to note that our soldiers are doing everything possible not only to hold the positions in the city that they have, but on the contrary, they are even conducting successful counterattacks, strengthening our positions. Now in Toretsk, soldiers from both the Presidential Brigade are fighting, and soldiers from separate police battalions, the Special Purpose Police Brigade called Vyat, are fighting in Toretsk itself and inflicting damage on a large number of Russian troops. There are very heavy battles here. The Russians are making every effort to surround Toretsk, cut off all communications, and possibly enter the city. The situation there is very difficult. And lastly, on the Siversk front, the situation in this area he describes as serious. The Russians are trying to completely capture Bilohorivka and the heights of the Dominion. Very heavy fighting is being waged by the soldiers of the 81st Airborne Assault and 54th Mechanized Brigades and the Battalion Tactical Group of the Saboda Battalion of the 4th Rubiz National Guard Brigade. Reinforcement is needed in this direction. Here too, the front of the Siversk balcony is being held with dignity, it should be noted that the soldiers of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade are destroying the Russians, but it is necessary to note the situation on the front of the 81st and 54th Brigades. The Russians are concentrating large forces in order to attack. In order to break through the front of these brigades and the junction between these brigades to defeat the Ukrainian soldiers, to completely capture Bilohorivka Heights and thus create a bridgehead for a direct attack on Siversk. A very threatening situation that also requires a serious response. So that's the assessment from Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov on the hotspot sectors of the front. But I could not leave this video without reading to you every word from this bombshell article from The Hill. And just take a look at this illuminating title. I rarely agree with President Trump, but his latest controversial statements about Ukraine are mostly true. They seem preposterous only because Western audiences have been fed a steady diet of disinformation about Ukraine for more than a decade. It is time to set the record straight on 3 key points that illuminate why Ukrainians and former President Joe Biden, not merely just President Vladimir Putin, bear significant responsibility for the outbreak and perpetuation of the war in Ukraine. First, as recently documented by overwhelming forensic evidence, the article writes, and affirmed even by a Kiev court, it was Ukrainian right-wing militants who started the violence in 2014 that provoked Russia's initial invasion of the country's southeast, including Crimea. Back then, Ukraine had a pro-Russia president, Viktor Yanukovych, who had won free and fair elections in 2010 with strong support from ethnic Russians in the country's southeast. In 2013, he decided to pursue economic cooperation with Russia rather than Europe as previously planned. Pro-Western activists responded with mainly peaceful occupation of the capital's Maidan Square and government offices until the president eventually ordered substantial concessions in mid-February 2014, after which they mainly withdrew. Just then, however, right-wing militants overlooking the square started shooting Ukrainian police and remaining protesters. Police returned fire at the militants, who then claimed bogously that the police had killed the unarmed protesters. Outraged by this ostensible government massacre, Ukrainians descended on the capital and ousted the president, who fled to Russia for protection. Putin responded by deploying troops to Crimea and weapons to the southeast Donbass region on behalf of ethnic Russians, who felt the president had been undemocratically overthrown. While this backstory does not justify Russia's invasion, it explains that it was hardly unprovoked.
Is not signed in the near future.
Second, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky contributed to a wider war by violating peace deals with Russia and seeking NATO military aid and membership. The deals, known as Minsk I and II, had been negotiated under his predecessor, President Petro Poroshenko, in 2014 and 2015 to end the fighting in the southeast and protect endangered troops. Ukraine was to guarantee Donbass limited political autonomy by the end of 2015, which Putin believed would be sufficient to prevent Ukraine from joining or serving as a military base for NATO. Regrettably, Ukraine refused for 7 years to fulfill that commitment. Zelensky even campaigned in 2019 on a promise to finally implement the accords to prevent further war, but after winning the election, he reneged, apparently less concerned about risking war than looking weak on Russia. Zelensky instead increased weapons imports from NATO countries, which was the last straw for Putin. So on February 21st of 2022, Russia recognized the independence of Donbass, deployed troops there for peacekeeping, and demanded Zelensky renounce his request for NATO military assistance and membership. When Zelensky again refused, Putin massively expanded his military offensive on February 24th. Intentionally or not, Zelensky had provoked Russian aggression. Let me repeat that. Intentionally or not, Zelensky had provoked Russian aggression, although that obviously does not excuse Moscow's subsequent alleged war crimes. Third, Joe Biden too contributed crucially to the escalation and perpetuation of fighting. In late 2021, when Putin mobilized forces on Ukraine's border and demanded implementation of the Minsk deals, it seemed obvious that unless Zelensky relented, Russia would invade to at least form a land bridge between Donbass and Crimea. Considering that Ukraine already was extensionally dependent on US military assistance, and President Biden had insisted that Zelensky comply with Putin's request, it would have happened. Instead, Biden lamentably left the decision to Zelensky and pledged that if Russia invaded, the US would respond swiftly and decisively, which Zelensky read as a green light to defy Putin. Had Trump been president, he likely would not have provided such a blank check, so Zelensky would have had little choice but to implement the Minsk deals to avert war. Even if Zelensky had still refused and provoked Russia to invade, Trump would have denied him a veto over peace negotiations, which Biden recklessly gave by declaring, "There is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine." That pledge tragically emboldened Ukraine to prolong the war in expectation of eventual decisive US military aid, which Biden then refused to supply due to fear of nuclear escalation. In that way, Biden raised false hopes in Ukraine, needlessly perpetuating a war that has killed or wounded hundreds of thousands in the last 2 years alone, during which the front lines have shifted by less than 1% of Ukraine's territory.
Давай.
Труба,